joining me today. I was taking a look into Chernobyl. Well, I'm starting to wonder about old Chernobyl. I think it might have been just sulfur and uranium that hit that area. This whole segment, lots of fishy things going on. Kind of reminds me, that old show, I Love Lucy. Ricky would come home after a long day at work to find out what Lucy and her friend Ethel had been up to. And he'd open the door and he'd say, Lucy, you got some explaining to do. Well, somebody's got some explaining to do here. Somebody does. Because in looking at Chernobyl and all this business about, well, the facts that the U.S. goes against sanctions to import Russian uranium, all the going back and forth, lung cancer is up, smoking is down, heart attacks are on the rise, fertility issue, cancer. Is it really what's going on in these power plants? Yeah, I think it is. Is it dirty electricity? Yeah, I really think it is. It looks like it's a combination of things. But before I get started, last show I was talking about the fact that the U.S. has been at war the majority of its existence. And then you want to ask the next question, well, has the U.S. ever been attacked? Because they're always acting like they're out to get us. Either the United States is run by a bunch of paranoid, delusional people, or it's all a plot, right? Well, the U.S. has been attacked, according to the records. First time, the War of 1812, the British forces burned down Washington, D.C. Well, it depends on your view of things. Well, according to what I feel, we lost the war. So British troops burning down Washington, D.C. was just a reset, right? Get rid of all the old records and stuff. And then, of course, they brought in all the books from, what was it, Jefferson. Yeah. So, yeah, they claim that was one time the U.S. was attacked. I call it the time they were just kind of like cleaning house, right? And getting ready for the next part of this game board, right? Burn all those records in Washington. So the War of 1812, then the next time they were supposedly attacked was Pearl Harbor attack. Well, Pearl Harbor was also a staged event put on by the people at that Tonka deal. The guy from Jim Morrison's dad, he was riding the boat. All these people connect. So they can claim that the U.S. was attacked during Pearl Harbor, but really not really. They also claim the U.S. was attacked on September 11th. Well, here again, it was an inside job. And all this time, we keep getting told that, well, it's all about the Russians and that communism is what we're being protected against, right? Well, I think it's all been a big collusion, all this communism business. Because remember, after World War II, all of a sudden the Russians became the big enemies, right? But up until World War II, there was, in fact, a much different story. After World War II, they came up with a Truman Doctrine, and that framed the global conflict as democracy versus communism. Got to get those communists. Got to protect them with this democracy. And of course, the Cold War emerged from all that, right? So, what that essentially did was it made foreign conflicts easier to sell to the public and to Congress, right? Everybody's out to get us, so we better come up with these ways to protect ourselves. And also, early on, it came up with a way to justify all this insane military spending, right? So it turned it all into this war country, right? So, and they claim it wasn't just fear, it was preventing the expansion of the Soviet influence, right? The fear was always, well, if one country shifts, others might follow, right? So they're always going in to protect a particular country. Well, if we don't protect this country, the communists are going to get them. Okay, so that's been the pattern all along. And this pattern, thank goodness for timelines, the pattern is all worked out and rigged, okay? So then the US and the Soviets began competing for military positions, political alignment, and global influence, right? Right after the war, all this stuff, they started competing, right? Right after World War II, it became communism versus capitalism. And that just affected everything from trade to resources and all the global things. Well, where did all that bring everybody? Well, I would say that During the war, the U.S. and the Russians during World War II were very cozy with each other. You'll find pictures of FDR hanging around, laughing, real palsy wowsies with the Russians, right? It was right after the war that the Russians became the bad guys, just like that within a year. And just like that, they also started providing power plants. The Russians did, just like that. So we're going to be talking about power plants today because the Russians, the communists, right? The people we must avoid at all costs. Well, they were the ones that came up with the very first nuclear power plant. That got installed in Russia. Then the next one got installed in the UK, and the US was third, okay? But let's look at a little bit of the history. Russia, or the Soviet Union, suffered the highest total losses during World War II. They were all in on protecting this democracy, right? The Russians were. They there was an estimated 20 to 27 million deaths just on the Russian side. So the Russians bore the brunt pretty much of as far as the death count goes, including both military personnel and civilians. The figure reflects the devastating impact of the war on the Eastern Front and occupied territories. So they lost between 20 and 27 million, right? Because obviously you don't lose that many people if you're not pretty friendly with these other countries, right? So all these people were such good friends, right? China was also in there. Little known fact, when they attacked Pearl Harbor, they attacked it from a base that was off of China. So yeah, the U.S. was operating bases in China, and the plane that attacked Pearl Harbor, excuse me, the plane that flew and supposedly dropped the nuclear bombs on Japan, they flew out of China. And a lot of people don't even realize this. Before Japan was bombed, the US actually bombed China, Wuhan, China. Yeah, with approval of the Chinese. Everybody is playing this game together. They just needed to act like they weren't, right? So China took some heavy losses during the war also. They took about 20 million people lost. And Germany took about 7.4 million people. So if you look at the numbers, Russia, 20 to 27 million, China, 20 million people. And who became the big enemies? Well, China and Russia, right? Germany lost 7.4. I'm not saying 7.4 isn't a lot of people, but when you compare it to Russia and China, who came out of World War II supposedly as a big bad enemy, right? Poland lost an estimated 6 million people, including the 3.2 million civilians in the concentration camps. So, what happened after that? Well, the war ends, right? Nazi Germany surrenders. And all of a sudden, the Nazis or the Germans and the Nazis are working together. So all of a sudden, the communism enters the picture, right? It enters the picture big time on July to August of 1945 through the Potsdam Conference. That was when the U.S. and Soviet tension became visible. Do, 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 do. Harry Truman replaced Franklin D. Roosevelt, who unfortunately had died by then, right? And they didn't really like Stalin so much. So they thought, well, maybe at this Potsdam conference we'll have a little fight between democracy and communism. And that is exactly what happened in May of 1945 after Nazi Germany surrendered. August of 1945, the Potsdam Conference, and all of a sudden, oh, the communism, we got to get rid of the communism, get away from those communists. So then the Cold War becomes a thing, 1946 and 1947. They come up with the Iron Curtain, thanks to Winston Churchill, and Europe becomes formally divided. 1947, we have the Truman Doctrine. The U.S. moves to contain that Soviet expansion because now those Russians are the enemy, that communism. And then, of course, we had 1947, the Marshall Plan. The Soviets rejected that and they blocked Eastern Europe. But of course, that was another sign those communists had to go. So, anyway, so as of 1947, the ideological conflict is an active policy. The lines are firmly divided. You ever wonder why they say, well, I'm going to draw a line in the sand? I never understood that one, but in this case, it makes sense. Now, if I'm going to take a stand, I'm going to draw a line in the cement, not in the sand, right? Well, this was actually a line in the sand, right? Movable, constantly ready to be shifted, right? So, in a July, so here we are. We're zooming along here, right? Got those communists over there, got these other people on the other side. Well, and thanks to the power of a timeline, in July of 1948, right after 1947, there was a memo outlining a program's intent before specifics had received final approval. A key focus was on the long lasting contamination of large land areas where residents would be told that unless the areas were abandoned, they probably would die from radiation within 1 to 10 years. One memo from December of 1948 outlined the project, and another memo that month indicated it was also underway. The main sections of several subsequent progress reports in 1949 were removed by censors before released to the Associated Press. The broader effort on offensive uses of radiological warfare apparently died by at least 1954, or so they say, at least in part because of the Defense Department's convictions that nuclear weapons were a better bet. Actually, this is a very interesting time. What this memo was saying, it was saying that they were going to start to use radiation on civilians. So that is why they split up, right? Let me talk a little bit about around the same time after they split up, they came up with competing systems. The US had the open markets, and the Soviet Union supposedly controlled buffer zones. And then they had all the deep World War II mistrust. They had the power vacuum after Germany collapses. That helped speed things up. And then right after, this is the part I always wondered about. Why did they do all of this nuclear testing after World War II? After World War II was when they bombed the daylights out of the Marshall Islands. 1946 to 1958, the U.S. nuclear testing on Marshall Islands. So in 1946, they started with Operation Crossroads, and they started testing at the Bikini Atoll. Between 1946 to 1958, 60 plus nuclear detonations. 1954, they had the Castle Bravo test, and it was the largest U.S. blast with widespread fallout. So, right after the war, they were doing all this nuclear testing, okay? So, that was the part that was very interesting. But along that same time frame, because all this bombing started around 1946, right? Around 1948 to 1949, they claimed it was open confrontation. So between 1948 to 1949, there was the Berlin blockage, and that was the U.S. airlift response. And then 1949, who comes along? Do, 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 do. NATO. Good morning over there, NATO. 1949, they cooked up NATO. What a lovely time, right? NATO was going to protect us from those commies, right? You come near any of us, you communists, and we're all going to attack you back. So then 1949, the Soviets had started doing their atomic tests also, right? So now the U.S. wasn't in charge anymore. The Soviets had entered the picture. The Soviets were out there testing things in 1949 in an area called, I can never pronounce it, but I always remember the Polygon, Polygon. The actual name is some of them SEMIPALYGON. So in 1949, at the Semiskuk or the Polygon site, that was established. Now they're running neck to neck, right? You got the U.S. over there, the Marshall Islands. You got the commies over there, the Polygon. So between 1949 and 1989, the Soviets bombed that area for much longer than the Americans did. They set off 450 nuclear tests, 450 in the atmosphere and underground. Now you're going to start to wonder, well, what were all those tests? Well, I have my suspicions, and I'll get to that in a second here. So then, right after that time frame, exactly right after that time frame in the 1950s, 3 years later, okay? 3 years later, who comes up with the same nuclear power plant? Well, if you guess the Russians, you'd be guessing correctly. 1954, the Obnik is called the OBNINSK nuclear power plant, the first power plant to generate electricity. Russia, okay? 1956, we have Calder Hall Nuclear Power Station in the UK. That's the first commercial scale. And keep in mind, I did shows about these. In both cases, they lied to the public about what these power plants were going to be all about. 1957, the U.S. comes up with their power plant called the Shippingport Atomic Power Station, and that's the first U.S. commercial plant. So starting in 1954, 1956, and 1957, one, two, three, right in a row, starting with those Russians, right? Gee, they're starting to kind of blend together, aren't they? Hmm. So let's reel back the time a little bit. What did they first find out in 1940s before all these meetings and the Russians and all these things got started? Well, funny you should ask. There was some 1940s work in microwave, microwaves, the signals. It represented the first systematic study of human exposure to high power microwave radiation. That was because they then had radar. Okay, so before all these power plants are built and all this fighting and the war and all this stuff happened, they actually had been studying microwaving. Okay, microwaving as in microwaving people, right? So that raised new concerns about occupational exposure, like, radar operators, technicians, and it also brought up the non ionizing radiation effects from the heating and the tissue specific absorption. So, from that first thing in the 40s, it established the idea that radiation doesn't have to be ionizing to cause biological harm. Pay very close attention to that. So, radiation does not have to be ionizing to cause biological harm. And that's what this is all about. There's either ionizing radiation or non-ionizing. And what they're doing is kind of slippery sloping the back and forth. For example, ionizing radiation would for sure be something like plutonium or something in the nuclear area, right? They claim that like, your microwave oven is non-ionizing. Well, I don't know how much of that is true, but I also am finding that in this statement alone, that radiation does not have to be ionizing to cause biological harm. Because what I have found is this. When they were bombing in the Marshall Islands, okay, there was some harm to the soldiers that were working in the area, very much harm, okay? Part of the cleanup, those soldiers were out there without any kind of protection. As a matter of fact, without even shirts on and swimming trunks and stuff, literally hauling all this stuff off to store it. Well, the area they stored it in was totally unprotected. They just buried it in the sand. Well, you don't bury something in the sand, right? You want to lay down some concrete first. And years ago, I thought, wow, that was really a big mistake, right? Well, I don't think it was a mistake, but on purpose, right? Because so what they did was they buried all the extra stuff from Marshall Islands in this one place. It's called the Dome, okay? So you got the dome sitting out there, and what they did was they just poured all the waste into this hole they dug, which was sand, which is very porous, right? And then they poured cement on the top part. Well, the top part has been leaking for years now, and that's been leaking out into the water. Well, those soldiers all got sick, right? And of course, they got hidden and everything else. But those soldiers did not start having children who were massively DNA uh, deformed. Okay, but when I looked at the Polygon area over in Russia, that was much more aggressive, that bombing. And yes, massively deformed children are showing up in that area there. Also, massively deformed children are showing up in Iraq. So I think in those two areas, there was probably just a higher concentration of uranium mixed in with the sulfur. So you'll get where I'm going with all this in a bit here. So anyway, so in the 40s, they were already testing human exposure to high power microwave radiation. So right off the bat, okay. And this didn't just start right there because it first started with X-rays in 1895. They started adapting to using X-rays. Early users were doctors and technicians, and the early users suffered burns and cancers. In the early, they claimed that safety standards came after that damage. And then there was radioactivity in the early 1900s, and that was discovered by Henri Becquerel and expanded by Marie Curie. And that was widespread exposure before the risks were understood. But in the early 20th century, 1900s to 1930s, medical radiation treatments were used aggressively. Industrial exposure was happening, and minimal informed consent by modern standards was happening. So anyway, so up until then, they didn't really have any standards, okay? So this new form of radiation they were calling microwaving, and they were using that for radar and military uses. Because earlier concerns were focused on the ionizing machines like the X-ray machines and the radium. So this was all new that they were looking into this microwave stuff, okay? And it was a big shift in research intent because the earlier radiation was framed as medical innovation, okay? And this is a critical part. And the microwave stuff, which started with all these early tests in the 40s, that was framed as operational hazard control. And that became a military effort, okay? Because radiation experiments on humans didn't start with the microwaves in the 40s. It started decades earlier with X-rays and radioactive materials. So then I'm going to be talking a little bit about this article. I'm going to just read the whole article for you here, and this will all start to make a great deal of sense. This is an article about this release of this thing, and I did a whole show about this, but this will put it all into context. Associated Press, October 9, 2007. U.S. considered radiological weapon. In one of the longest held secrets of the Cold War, the U.S. Army explored the potential for using radioactive poisons to assassinate important individuals, such as military or civilian leaders, according to newly declassified documents obtained by the Associated Press. Approved at the highest levels of the Army in 1948, the effort was a well hidden part of the military's pursuit of a new concept of warfare, using radioactive materials from atomic bomb making to contaminate swaths of enemy land or to target military bases, factories, or troop formations. Military historians who have researched the broader radiological warfare program said in interviews that they had never before seen evidence that it included pursuit of an assassination weapon. Targeting public figures in such attacks is not unheard of. Just last year, an unknown assailant used a tiny amount of radioactive polonium 210 to kill Kremlin critic Alexander Leibowitz in London. No targeted individuals are mentioned in references to the assassination weapon in the government documents declassified in response to a Freedom of Information request filed by the Associated Press in 1995. The decades-old records were released recently to the AP, heavily censored by the government to remove specifics about radiological warfare agents and other details. The censorship reflects concerns that the potential for using radioactive poisons as a weapon is more than a historical footnote. It is believed to be sought by present-day terrorists bent on attacking U.S. targets. The documents give no indication whether a radiological weapon for targeting high-ranking individuals was ever used or ever developed by the United States. They leave unclear how far the Army project went. One memo from December 1948 outlined the project, and another memo that month indicated it was underway. The main sections of several subsequent progress reports in 1949 were removed by censors before release to the AP. The broader effort on offensive uses of radiological warfare apparently died by about 1954, at least in part because of the Defense Department's conviction that nuclear weapons were a better bet. Whether the work migrated to another agency, such as the CIA, is unclear. The project was given final approval in November 1948 and began the following month, just 1 year after the CIA's creation in 1947. It was a turbulent time on the international scene. In August 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb, and 2 months later, Mao Zedong's communist triumphed in China's civil war. As U.S. scientists developed the atomic bomb during World War II, it was recognized that radioactive agents used or created in the manufacturing process had lethal potential. The government's first public report on the bomb project, published in 1945, noted that radioactive fission products from a uranium-fueled reactor could be extracted and used like a particularly vicious form of poison gas. Among the documents released to the AP, an Army memo dated December 16, 1948, and labeled secret, described a crash program to develop a variety of military uses for radioactive materials. Work on a subversive weapon for attack of individuals or small groups was listed as a secondary priority to be confined to feasibility studies and experiments. The top priorities listed were this: 1. Weapons to contaminate populated or otherwise critical areas for long periods of time. Munitions combining high explosives with radioactive material to accomplish physical damage and radioactive contamination simultaneously. Air and or surface materials that would spread contamination across an area to be evacuated, thereby rendering it unusable by enemy forces. The stated goal was to produce a prototype for the number 1 and number 2 priority weapons by December 31, 1950. The fourth ranked priority was munitions for attack on individuals using radioactive agents for which there is no means of therapy. Did you hear that? Munitions for attack on individuals using radioactive agents for which there is no means of therapy. This class of munitions is proposed for use by secret agents or subversive units for lethal attack against small groups or important individuals. For example, during meetings of civilian or military leaders. Assassination of foreign figures by agents of the U.S. government was not explicitly outlawed until President Gerald R. Ford signed an executive order in 1976 in response to revelations that the CIA had plotted in the 1960s to kill Cuban President Fidel Castro, including by poisoning. The December 16, 1948 memo said a lethal attack against individuals using radiological material should be done in a way that makes it impossible to trace U.S. government's involvement, a concept known as plausible deniability that is central to U.S. covert actions. The source of the munition, the fact that an attack had been made, and the kind of attack should not be determinable if possible, it said. The munition should be inconspicuous and readily transportable. Radioactive agents were thought to be ideal for this use, the document said, because of their high toxicity and the fact that the targeted individuals could not smell, taste, or otherwise sense the attack. It should be possible, for example, to develop a very small munition which could function unnoticeably and which would set up an invisible yet highly lethal concentration in a room with the effects noticeably only well after the time of attack. The time for lethal effects could, it is believed, be controlled within limits of the amount of radioactive agent dispersed. The toxicities are such that should relatively high concentrations be required for early lethal effects on a weight basis, even such concentrations may be found practicable. Tom Bulford, a Harvard physicist who has studied radiological weapons issues, said that while he had never heard of this project, its technical aims sounded feasible. Biddlefield noted that polonium, the radioactive agent used to kill Leviticus in November of 2006, has just the kind of features that would be suitable for the lethal mission described in the December 16th memo. Barton Bernstein, a Stanford history professor who has done extensive research on the U.S. military's radiological warfare efforts, said he did not believe this aspect had previously come to light. This is one of those items that surprises us, but should not shock us, because in the Cold War, all kinds of ways of killing people in all kinds of manners, inhumane, barbaric, and even worse, were periodically contemplated at high levels in the American government in which was seen as a just war against a hated and hateful enemy, Bernstein said. The project was run by the American Chemical Corporation, commanded by Major General Alden Waite, WAITT, and supervised by a now defunct agency called the Armed Forces Special Weapons Project. The project's first chief was Major General Leslie R. Groves, the Army's head of the Manhattan Project that built the first atomic bombs. The radiological project was approved by Groves' successor, Major General Kenneth D. Nichols. The released documents were in files of the Armed Forces Special Weapons Project held by the National Archives. Among the officials copied in on the December 16th memo were Herbert Schofield Jr., then the technical director of the Armed Forces Special Weapons Project, and later the CIA's deputy director for research, and Samuel T. Cohen, a physicist and Rand Corporation who had worked on the Manhattan Project. The initial go ahead for the Army to pursue its radiological weapons project was given in May of 1948, a point in U.S. history following the successful use of two atomic bombs against Japan to end World War II, when the military was eager to explore the implications of atomic science for the future of warfare. In a July 1948 memo outlining the program's intent, before specifics had received final approval, a key focus, this is key, was on long term contamination of large areas where residents would be told that unless the areas were abandoned, they probably would die from radiation within 1 to 10 years. And that is why today I'm talking about Chernobyl. Okay. So this was predicted in 1948. Okay. It is thought that this new concept of warfare with results that cannot be predicted. And that is the key. So we're going to start looking a little bit into the people from Chernobyl because there's a lot of things which do not add up. If you look at the overview for Chernobyl, you'll hear, yep, lots of cancers, this and that. Well, come to find out, I didn't find much of that to be even remotely to be true. What I found to be true and interesting was this: Chernobyl was a huge power plant that provided electricity for Russia. I believe, full stop, Chernobyl was the Russian version of destroying their own citizens' lives because Chernobyl was where they were mixing this plutonium, I think just a little dash of plutonium with a whole lot of sulfur. And that is what that power station was all about over there in Russia because just like the US, everything has been mirrored exactly the same in Russia because they're all exactly working together. So first I started looking into well, how are they saying that these people even have radiation, right? Well, they called the workers liquidators, okay? And they were assigned radiation doses, but not chemical exposure. And I'm going to keep it very simple. The recorded doses were meant to represent exposure to gamma radiation, beta radiation, which would be the skin and near surface exposure, and internal exposure, okay? Because if it was external, you'd have all these symptoms that some of these people showed up with. If it was in fact nuclear, that is longer acting, okay? And that would in fact create deformed children and whatnot. So in order to rise to the level that I found in Iraq and also over at the Polygon, you got to have pretty decent amounts of radiation exposure in here, which I'm really not seeing. Okay, I don't want to bury the lead, and I'm going to drag you through a million things, and I have everything you ever want to look at down below. But so what they did was they have this thing called radiation medicine. Okay, and I was a little bit stumped by, well, what's radiation medicine, right? Well, what they did was they just came up with this plan, and the radiation medicine actually started in the 1800s, and the radiation medicine started with the Marie Curie and all those people because they're the ones that identified radioactive elements like radium and plutonium, okay, or the polonium. So at that stage, doctors knew radiation could see inside the body and kill cells. And then early in the 1900s, they recognized early radiologists started getting burns and cancer and tissue damage themselves. And that is when they finally realized that radiation isn't just useful, but it's actually dangerous. And that first led to some safety limits, okay, and early dose concepts. And that's all under what they call radiation medicine. So it's kind of radiation medicine was developed by a whole bunch of different things all stacked together. So radiation medicine really got going in the 1940s to the 50s under the Manhattan Project. And that was a big turning point with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And at that point, scientists and governments felt they needed to understand what radiation does to the human body, how much exposure can cause illness or death, and how to treat radiation sickness. And that point is where modern radiation medicine really gets formed, okay? And then it gets institutionalized during this whole Cold War era. And different agencies came in place. We had the Atomic Energy Commission, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and of course the who are you going to call the World Health Organization. And they also were able to develop new things about this nuclear medicine thing. They developed this thing called the Sieverts and the exposure limits and medical response protocols. So that's actually what they came up with next was how much radiation someone could absorb and the potential risk for cancer and organ damage and all of that. And they were getting treating exposure for bone marrows and all that. So anyway, um so radiation medicine actually spreads across oncology, emergency medicine, occupational medicine, and military medicine. So on this radiational medicine thing, everybody's involved in this, okay? Because it started with those X-ray people and blah blah blah, and it moved down the line. So radiation medicine wasn't just invented by one person. It grew out of trial, error, and damage. Scientists first used radiation to see inside the body. Then they realized it could harm the body. And over time, they built a system to measure, track, and treat exposure, especially after nuclear weapons and disasters forced them to understand it. So that is exactly how it all happened, okay? And let me give you just a little bit of a sample here. Your body is made up of tiny little pieces like building blocks. Radiation is something you can't see, but it's like invisible energy. A little bit can help doctors take pictures inside your body like an x ray. Too much is like a tiny invisible fire that can hurt your cells. So, what does radiation medicine really mean? It is just doctors trying to answer three simple questions. Did you get hit by the invisible energy? How much did you get? How do we help your body feel better? So that is exactly how it all works, right? And you don't get this longer term DNA stuff from sulfur, so to speak, but you do get the DNA from all the other parts of the ionizing parts of the radiation. So doctors come in and they ask these questions, okay? So in the case of Chernobyl, they went looking for damage and they did blood tests looking for white blood cells. They did checks on the thyroid and they looked for symptoms like nausea, fatigue, and burns. And so then when they looked at all that, they decide that treatment, well, the treatment they have is iodine pills. And supposedly, iodine pills block radioactive iodine from the thyroid. So, that is the main line of support are iodine pills, okay? And I've spoken about iodine pills in the past, but to keep it all in context, I'll be talking about them here. So, they say that iodine can protect the thyroid from the harmful effects of radiation, as it helps to fill the thyroid gland with regular iodine, preventing it from absorbing radioactive iodine. So what they basically say is this is that when you get hit by a nuclear attack, it goes after the iodine in your system, okay? But if you take iodine pills before or right around the attack. It will fill that up so you won't absorb the radioactive iodine. Now, if any of that is making sense, good for you, okay? So, in the case of nuclear power plant accidents, iodine pills can be effective in the first weeks after the accident when the main hazard is radioactive iodine. So, in order to respond to this radioactive iodine, you take iodine pills, okay? The pills can make the person marginally safer, but only, and this is very important, only if the nuclear bomb goes off within several miles. Iodine is also used as a contrast agent in radiology, x rays, and computed ionography of the vascular system or the gastrointestinal tract. So they know that iodine will supposedly stop the thyroid from getting hit by nuclear, okay? Supposedly, okay? So this is what people were getting at Chernobyl was iodine pills, okay? So in order to understand what's going on in a bit here, you need to understand these iodine pills, okay? Because in the 1940s and 50s, scientists began using radioactive iodine, I-130, in medicine. And here again, just like with that chemotherapy, they're taking something that's very toxic and turn it into medicine. So they take radioactive iodine, or I-131, and they use it to image the thyroid and to treat thyroid disease. What they observed was when radioactive iodine is introduced, it accumulates heavily in the thyroid. And then they say the thyroid receives a much higher radiation dose than the rest of the body. So they say if you give large amounts of stable iodine first, the thyroid becomes saturated. It stops absorbing additional iodine, including radioactive forms. This is the basis of what they call potassium iodine, or Ki. Okay? That's all you have to remember is Ki. So during the US and Soviet atmospheric nuclear tests from the 1940s to the 1960s, when they're over there blowing up Marshall Islands and then the Polygon, they say the fallout contained radioactive iodine. It contaminated pasture grasses, cows, and milk. And they claim the children drinking the milk received high thyroid doses. So, for some reason, and you'll find, I don't know why, but for some reason, they make this whole thyroid story having to do with children drinking milk and it's harming their thyroids. So, by the Cold War, it was standard emergency planning. Before Chernobyl, many countries already had plans to distribute potassium iodine, or the Ki, prioritizing children and pregnant women first, and use it immediately after exposure, okay? So when Chernobyl happened, they already had a playbook for how to use this iodine, right? So they knew because of a chain of evidence. They knew that the biology, that the thyroid actively concentrates iodine. They knew in the field of medicine that radioactive iodine visibly accumulates there. And they knew from experiments that stable iodine blocks that uptake. And they also knew from real world fallout that thyroid damage shows up in exposed populations. Well, it also makes sense too because your thyroid is where you're breathing, right? And you're taking in contaminated air and you're hitting past your throat and your thyroid, right? I mean, this is just kind of common sense. So during Chernobyl, millions of people took these thyroid pills, okay? But adherence was very uneven, and many either did not take it at all or didn't take it correctly long enough. So, for the Chernobyl event, how many people actually took the iodine? roughly 5.5 million people were given potassium iodine after the accident. In Poland alone, it was administered on a massive scale to about 10.5 million children and adults all mixed in. So, literally tens of millions of doses across multiple countries were given this iodine after Chernobyl, okay? But here's the problem. A lot of people didn't even take the iodine in the first place. So, and this is why if you go looking for something, you have to keep asking more and more questions because at first it sounds like, oh yeah, iodine was a solution, right? But then you have to keep asking more questions like, okay, well, how many people took the iodine? How many people didn't take the iodine? You know, how long did people take the iodine for? So, and that's where I came up with all this information. So only 25% of the population claimed that they took the iodine pills. 66% said they did not take it at all, and 9% weren't sure. So, that's a pretty big gap in people, right? So, and here's why. Iodine only works if taken right before or shortly after exposure. Many people got it too late. So, people didn't clearly understand what it was, why they needed it, and how long to take it. So, and also the side effects. Potassium iodine can cause stomach upset, rash, metallic taste, swelling of glands, thyroid disturbances. So, um, and also, if you take too much iodine, it could actually disrupt the thyroid itself. So, I'm pretty sure, and I want to be very clear, this is not medical advice from me to you, but I'm pretty sure, well, I'm 100% sure that I wouldn't take iodine pills if they gave them to me. Well, first of all, look at who's given to you, right? The government shows up and says, here, take these pills. Do you think that's a good idea on any level based on what they've shown themselves to be? No, I don't think so. But anyway, so yeah, if you take too much, you can disrupt the thyroid itself. So you hand out a bunch of pills. You don't tell people how many to take, how often to take them, or what the deal is. Granted, some people probably took too many, right? Disrupting their own thyroid. So because some countries like Poland pushed mass dosing aggressively. Other parts like Russia were slower, inconsistent, or limited distribution. So and this is what's important. These iodine pills only protect the thyroid. They only block radioactive iodine I-131. They do nothing for any other radiation type. So unless you specifically, within right after you get it or right before you got it, this I-131 radioactive iodine, unless you get that, these iodine pills aren't going to catch you in time. And also, you're going to get a lot of these same symptoms as getting sick from nuclear does because stomach upset, throwing up, headaches, colds, runny noses, and cold like symptoms, skin rashes, yeah, fevers and joint pain. So, um, it works by flooding the thyroid with iodine, and that can disrupt the gland itself, especially with repeated dosing. So, yeah, and like I said, I want to be very clear, not medical advice. If they come to you and say, "Hey, take these iodine pills," if you think it's a good idea, then by all means, gobble away. I think you're looking for trouble, but anyway, so then they claim that Chernobyl disaster caused significant harm. Well, I'm not sure where all the harm is coming from, right? Some of the harm they claim came from acute radiation syndrome or ARS, and that was diagnosed in 134 emergency workers who were on the site of the Chernobyl power plant during the night of the accident. Of these of these people, 28 of them died of a result of the acute radiation syndrome or ARS. Yes, that could also happen from sulfur exposure, right? I think if you have a lot of sulfur and a tiny bit of nuclear in there, the nausea just really increases. So, yeah, you get the nausea, the vomiting, and the diarrhea, headaches, burns, and fever. So, yeah, a lot of people early, I'm talking early responders, got all of that stuff, right? Because they went right into where the worst part of it was. And there is so much system overlap in all of this because nausea, vomiting, headaches, dizziness, weakness, confusion, and even blood pressure, they're not just unique to acute radiation syndrome. They also show up in toxic gas or chemical exposure syndromes, including hydrogen sulfide exposure. So, uh, the material on hydrogen sulfide describes neurological symptoms such as dizziness, confusion, headache, nausea, and vomiting. So, yeah, the patterns and the severity line up exactly with also with the sulfur exposure. So, so you got the overlapping of the nausea and the vomiting, the headaches, the dizziness, the weakness, confusion. So yeah, and sometimes you get low blood pressure because of severe toxic exposure. So, and they claim that to push this further, more toward a nuclear thing, away from a sulfur thing, you get hair loss, infections from bone marrow failure, and bloody stools or bloody vomit, also known a high dose radiation event. So, yeah, but then also, you also, in the sulfur, you got the eye, nose, throat, and lung irritations. You got the chest. So, I mean, the overlap is, well, I have a hard time seeing the difference between the sulfur and the uranium. The only thing I'm saying is that in a couple of places, I think they used too much of the uranium and they got the DNA damage down generations. That would be Iraq and the Polygon area. I think that was when they were doing all that testing in those particular areas, they just threw in more. Because the main difference between acute and chronic radiation effects is on the duration and intensity of the exposure. You have acute radiation exposure occurs over a short period, and that's when you get hit really hard. Okay, it can be like within minutes. Okay, this kind of exposure can result from events like nuclear accidents, medical treatments like radiation therapy, or even certain industrial accidents. The effects of acute exposure can be severe and immediate, including symptoms like nausea, vomiting, skin burns, and extreme cases, radiation sickness. So, yeah, then there's also chronic radiation exposure. I think chronic is what I'm getting. Chronic, on the other hand, involves receiving smaller doses of radiation over an extended period, such as months or years. This type of exposure is more common in everyday life and can come from natural sources like radon gas, cosmic rays, yeah, or your house, right? So anyway, I think it came from dirty electricity. And here's another interesting thing about Chernobyl. I was looking into Chernobyl on a couple of different of the AI chatbots. One was the AI chatbot run by Yandex, which is obviously a Russian-owned place, right? And I ran across this other thing that I didn't. I kind of remember this, but I didn't remember it. There was on March of 2022. The Russians actually went into which is now Ukraine, into what's called the Chernobyl exclusion zone. And what they did was they went into that zone and they took some monitoring equipment. I'm not going to go into the whole deal about it, but here's what I'm suspicious about was they were there to probably grab back some more records or something because monitoring and scientific equipment was stolen. Equipment was offline. Computers and technical infrastructure, 1,000 plus computers, monitors, and hard drives. Software systems used for plant operations and research. They took vehicles and stuff. Well, that's no big deal, right? But They said some reports indicate radioactive sources used for research were taken from the lab. So, what were they in there taking? It looks to me like they were taking more research paperwork, right? Um, it was items like computers and electronics. So yeah, monitoring systems, data infrastructure. So yeah, that might have been what they were in there looking for. But anyway, so that's just what I ran into in the meantime. Um, so were they there? Were they there to grab back some stuff they didn't get before? It could be. So anyway, so here's where the timeline fits in. Now, let's start off in 1945. The U.S., the first to build and use the atomic bomb. Soviet Union, 1949. First successful test 4 years after the U.S. If you're wondering why, that's because the U.S. handed the things off to the Soviets. And I'll have a clip to play for you in a minute that will clear that all up. So the U.S. was the first to build the atomic bomb in 1945. FDR was president during the creation and wartime development of the Manhattan Project. So anyway, so I have a little bit of timeline here, but I'm going to need to let me see here. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to be taking a break here, but I'm going to be playing this clip. So let me scroll down and tell you what the clip is all about. Hang on one second here. Okay, the clip I'm going to be playing is a man speaking. His name is Galen Windsor, Galen Windsor, Winsor. If you look him up, you will find this. Windsor, they'll claim that he was not a renowned physicist. That's according to like Snopes or one of those things, but rather had a degree in chemistry and worked as a nuclear chemist. They claim they were unable to verify the substance that Windsor consumed in the video or confirm whether it was broadcast live or on television. It is a viral video that has circulated on social media for years, allegedly showing a renowned physicist named Galen Windsor, who purportedly ate uranium on live television in 1985 to prove it was harmless. This claim has been shared across platforms like Instagram and Facebook, often accompanied by statements asserting Windsor's belief that the dangers of radiation were exaggerated. For instance, one Instagram post with the video read this: Galen Windsor was a renowned physicist in the United States. He designed and worked on many nuclear power plants. Windsor believed that the fear of radiation has been exaggerated so that a few powerful people can control power sources like coal and oil. To prove his point, Windsor ate uranium live on camera. He swam in the reactor cooling pools to convince the public and also drank the nuclear reactor water to prove his point. Windsor died in 2008 at 82 due to an unknown cause. So, Galen Windsor was a nuclear physicist and safety manager who worked at several nuclear power plants in the United States. He was a controversial figure who claimed that nuclear radiation was harmless and that the public was being deceived by an energy cartel that wanted to control the supply and price of nuclear fuel. He even demonstrated his beliefs by swimming in a pool of spent fuel rods, drinking radioactive water, and eating uranium. But what was the real cause of his death? Did he die from leukemia or Parkinson's, as some sources suggest? No, I think Galen Windsor just died of old age, but I'm not going to speculate. Nobody knows. People will try to speculate, but not that important. Galen Hewlett Windsor was born on June the 4th, 1926 in Kansas. Same year my mother was born. He served in the U.S. Navy during World War II and later studied chemistry at Kansas State University. He worked as a chemist and safety manager at various nuclear facilities, including Hanford Site, Oak Ridge National Laboratory, Morris Operation, General Electric Nuclear Fuel Plant, and DuPont Nuclear Fuel Plant. He was involved in the design and operation of nuclear reactors, as well as the measurement and control of nuclear fuel inventory and storage. Windsor became a vocal critic of the nuclear industry and its regulations, which he considered to be excessive and unnecessary. He argued that nuclear radiation was not as dangerous as commonly believed, and that low level exposure could even have beneficial effects on health. He accused the government and the energy cartel of spreading fear and misinformation about nuclear power in order to limit its use and increase its cost. He also claimed that there is no such thing as nuclear waste and the spent fuel rods can be recycled and reused. To prove his point, Windsor performed several daring stunts involving radioactive materials. He swam in a pool where spent fuel rods were kept, drank water from the pool, ate uranium pellets, held plutonium in his bare hands, and carried a sample of radioactive material in his pocket for several years. He claimed that he never suffered any ill effects from these actions, that he had a normal blood count and no signs of cancer. I think that Galen Windsor was onto something. He is a man that I would be glad to know and shake his hand. Galen Windsor exposed the first part of this scam, so you're going to have to decide for yourself, is he in fact crazy or is he in fact telling the truth? I think the guy is telling the truth, full stop. I'm going to play his clip right now, get some rest, and I will see you on the other side.
I'm pleased to have as our guest Mr. Galen Windsor from Richland, Washington. I first heard of Galen from a tape that somebody gave to me some months ago, and I found his story to be absolutely fascinating. His story is unique, to say the least. Galen has been in 77 different cities in the last 2 years lecturing on the subject of nuclear energy. The majority of his life, the last 35 years, he spent processing plutonium from nuclear reactor sites. He has worked in the Manhattan Project facilities in Hanford, Washington, Oak Ridge National Laboratories and Nuclear Plant in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, General Electric's Midwest Fuel Recovery Plant in Morris, Illinois, General Electric's Fuel Fabrication Facility in San Jose, California, and Wilmington, North Carolina. And he's worked in every major reactor decommissioning project around this nation up to this present time. His major work in these projects has been the analytical process inventory control, which means that he was responsible for measuring and controlling the nuclear fuel inventory for these projects. Galen Windsor has few peers in the world in this area of expertise. And those few peers admittedly know and agree with the things that you'll be hearing on this tape. However, except for 2 or 3 of these experts, they've all chosen to remain silent for reasons which they only know, leaving this man then the burden of leading this lonely battle of exposing what we call the nuclear scare scam. He's without question one of the world's foremost authorities in nuclear radiation measurement, and he's recognized by members of the Atomic Energy Commissions of all the major nations of the free world. Mr. Galen Windsor.
Thank you, Ben. We've been considering today how best to approach this subject so that you would feel comfortable with where I am. And we thought it might be appropriate to start with how I got involved in this game. Now, in 1945, I was a Navy radioman out in the Pacific on a destroyer aimed for Japan. We had a one-way ticket. That's all you get, just one way. So as we were becoming proficient at our business of fighting war, the Manhattan Project caught up with us and did a job. Now, the weapon that was dropped on Hiroshima, Japan in August 6, 1945 was a U-235, fully enriched U-235 weapon, where the material was separated and purified in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. The one that was dropped August 9th on Nagasaki was a plutonium weapon made at Hanford. But to those of us out in the Pacific, it was quite interesting. It had a ticket on it that says, "You get to go home." I was impressed. Now, I was stuck out on Guam after the hostilities quit and was running a radio broadcast that communicated with 4,500 ships west of Pearl Harbor. Quite a few to listen to every dot and dash that I made. So I was used to having people listening to me. They couldn't see me, but they could sure hear me. I had all of the good messages that were to come to them. Fleet movements to Red Cross messages. They came along one day and says, "We'd like to have radiomen to go down to Eniwetok for the atomic bomb tests." Not me. No way. I want to go home. So they went through and they took every third radioman to go to Eniwetok. I didn't go. They let me come home. But I wanted to go home. I had a driving need within me that says, hey, that big firecracker, I want to know how it works. I want to know everything about how it works. So, back to the ranch in Nevada where I grew up and stacked hay all summer, gained back the 40 pounds that I'd lost out there in the islands. Into Brigham Young University in the fall of '46 in chemistry classes. Dr. Joseph Nichols could make an old farm kid like me love chemistry. I hadn't had any chemistry in high school, but the way Joe Nichols taught it, I wanted to know. So chemistry it was. And some neat guys like Carl Eyring taught me physics. And along in '47, I ran across a cute blonde from Richland, Washington. Now this girl had been telephone operator for General Leslie Groves and Dr. Enrico Fermi on the Manhattan Project. She got to put through the calls to Franklin Delano Roosevelt for these guys. So she talked personally to FDR. And she told me some of the stories like you've never heard. She says, oh, in those canyons, great things are done. This cowboy from Nevada couldn't even imagine what she was talking about. Well, in 1947, after we were married, I ran until she caught me. I wasn't going to get married anyway. I wanted to get my education. I had to get on with this thing. And so we went to Richland, Washington for the first time in September of 1947. I saw that those buildings she was talking about were there. 1,000 feet long, 11 stories high, 5 of them below ground. Tremendous things. And people all over. Camp Hanford in those days was a whole army camp just there to secure that place, to provide security. Thousands of soldiers. You move around out in the desert and hop out of a foxhole and pop a soldier. with a gun in his hand. There wasn't any horsing around. It was all business. Back to school. In 1950, I applied for a job up there before I'd graduated, and they were in such bad need of chemists, I had a job before I had my degree. And so the last year of my chemistry, mostly English, I did on a bus, riding 25 miles to work in the morning and 25 miles back at night. And I did advanced grammar and business writing and all of those things on that bus. But in September 1950, I got into this thing called plutonium processing when we did it barehanded, without instruments, without coveralls. We had some of the most peculiar acid burns in some of the shirts. And I found one of those the other day. It's got acid burns all up the front of it. Plutonium on it, too. Amazing. That was normal operation in those days. We ran those facilities, and we ran them so well that by 1965, we had separated enough plutonium when it only existed in the parent uranium matrix to a half of a single weight percent, 0.005 weight fraction of plutonium maximum in that fuel. And we processed enough tons of uranium to recover enough plutonium by 1965 to meet the weapons needs of this country 10 times over for the foreseeable future. Now we're talking about a massive amount of work. Hands-on, do it type thing. And there was a couple thousand of us, and we were just happy as could be, just working like mad, making those plants run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, in a community that ran on shift work, ABCD shift. The whole community that way. A wartime community, people dedicated to doing a job, and we were doing it, and we did it well. No pretense. Oh, yes, there were. Out in the reactor began to sneak in people who wanted a radiation monitor behind every reactor operator. Why? We know how to make these things run. When we got a metal fuel element stuck and it fell down on the trampoline back of the reactor, we'd go in with our feet and kick it off into the pool, smoking, burning. If you didn't have an instrument, you didn't know it was too hot, so you just went in and kicked it. Finally, along came a rule maker that says, "Thou shalt not do that. You'll get burned." Oh, I didn't get burned when I did it last week. But you exceeded the limit. Well, where did this limit come from? Turns out that in 1934, the International Commission on Radiation Protection fabricated a limit for X-rays. It was no longer permissible to be burned by them, erythema, reddening of the skin. You now had to keep a limit called 0.2 of an hour per day. How much is that? Well, you've got to have one of these Beckman instruments to read it, and you have to keep time of exposure. You know, there are 4 requirements on this thing: the size of the source, therefore the strength of the source, the distance from the source, the time of exposure, and the intervening shielding to keep from getting burned. Oh, fine. We've been doing this thing for years now, and we've never been burned. Why have we got these rules? And they says, yours is not to ask questions, yours is to do and die. Don't you ask questions. If you do, you might disappear. Those who broke the rules didn't appear the next day. Military rule? Oh, yes. Absolute. What was your appeal? And people you were working with one day When they weren't there the next day, you didn't go inquire why. You were just grateful you still had your work to do, and you kept right on doing it. Now, this is in the United States of America. Well, in 1960, we found out that the materials that we were working with, the thing that we called high-level waste, that if you waited 3 years, these million-gallon tanks that high-level waste went into boiled off 15,000 gallons of water a day. Fairly hot? Oh, yes. This material that if it ever broke a line would seal itself off in the ground within a foot, make its own glass. It wasn't going to go anyplace. We did that a time or two, accidentally, of course. And so we started packaging this cesium-137 in casks in railroad cars like that and shipping it to Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And they'd take it out and make it into a barium titanate and press it into a pellet, and those things were so hot that they actually glowed in the dark from the infrared heat. Now, thermo-ionic conversions came along at this time, so you hooked these little heat sources up to thermionic converters and you took electricity out this side. No moving parts. These things went into the SNAP program. And these early SNAP power generators are what powered the underwater transmitters for our nuclear navy. We've got a regular road map under the sea. All you got to do is have an instrument that knows how to find it, and then you've got eyes on a submarine. You didn't know that, did you? The power from it came from this material that they now call waste. We processed that stuff and packaged it outside at Hanford. Well, we had rules that said 3R per year is your allowable exposure, that amount of gamma energy that will expose a film pack. But that was for the people that didn't know. We weren't about to follow those rules. We just went ahead and did the job. They send around an investigation slip that says your dosimeter was overexposed 2 weeks ago. What did you do? And they had a cute little form on it that says accidentally exposed to light, and that was the one I always used to check. Because it's the same amount of light. You know, if you get gamma through the film pack, it's the same amount of light as you get when you click the lens on a camera. They wanted to limit us to that. And one day we looked up, and they had. They had limited us to that amount of exposure. Then the fun part of the game begins. You say, who limited us to that? Are they powerful? Yeah, they control the purse strings. They live by the golden rule. Them that's got the gold makes the rules. If you like your work, you keep the rules. If you don't keep the rules, you disappear. Sure enough, some of us disappeared. Some of my friends gone. Where'd they go? I don't know. Well, 2 years ago, I started traveling for American Opinion Speakers Bureau, and one of the documents that they had was Major Jordan's diary. A story of shipping the technology and the materiel that was developed at Hanford in 1944 directly to Russia on U.S. Air Force planes out through Great Falls, Montana, Fairbanks, Alaska, under the auspices of one Harry Hopkins, and with the at least tacit approval of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now what are you going to do? That thing that we had been doing and feeling so good about had been shared at no expense with Russia. You go back and you check the record and you find Russia did not develop their own nuclear atomic weapon until 1949, even when we supplied them the material and the knowledge. 4 years after we touched them off at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We weren't happy with that. We were just happy doing our job. Well, in 1965, General Electric was ready to leave Hanford. I'd worked for General Electric for that 15 years, and they took me out to California, San Jose, and we had in mind to design and build this nuclear fuel reprocessing plant at Morris, Illinois. They told me they were going to build it at San Luis Obispo. That's how they got me away from Hanford. But that was just to get me away from Hanford. I got to design the sampling analytical system for this plant. The sample cell was the hydraulic heart of this place. I got to dictate where they put the columns, how high the columns were in relation to my sample cell. One man standing in front of a lead glass window could sample any liquid stream in that whole plant. It took crews of men at Hanford to do the same thing. I wasn't happy with that, so I built an efficient system. I got to design that. I got to build it. Conceptual design, detailed design, build it, operationally test it. And in 1973, they says, forget it, friends, you don't get to run it. We had 170 tons, metric tons of spent fuel stored in the basin. And the then President of the United States, do you remember who it was? Jerry Ford. Says, friends, no way, you don't get to run it. That's when I started to kick over the traces. Up to that point of time, I thoroughly enjoyed my work. I had no limitations, practical limitations. I had all the money to spend. I was in charge of the design effort. I built it the way that I wanted to because it was technically correct. All I had to do was check with engineers and make sure that it was right. And all of a sudden I was told, you must reduce your limits of exposure by a factor of 10. I says, I won't do it. First thing you know, you got the word that says, oh, yes, you will. I says, no way. Well, that's when the rebel, Galen Windsor, started to show up. And when I found out that by management conference I couldn't get to these guys, I figured out another way. Now, in this plant is a beautiful pool. It's got a place to store spent fuel bundles till it won't stop. 660,000 gallons of water, demineralized, just as clear and pretty as it can be. Heated to 100 degrees Fahrenheit when the outside temperatures are minus 20, wind chill factors down to a minus 60, and I found out that I could swim in that rascal. You turn off the lights at night and it had a light blue Cherenkov effect. And this kid from Nevada that never could pass up a warm swimming hole used to go swimming in that pool. There wasn't anybody that had the nerve to swim with me, but since I was manager of safety and analytical services at this plant, it was mine to use. Oh boy. I found out that I could do that. I showed some financial types one time that I could stir that pool with my bare hand and check out through the same radiation monitors they did without triggering it. GE didn't like it. I got a letter from him that says, thou shalt not tell financial types that you can swim in the pool, that you can stir it with your hand, because if they find that out, they will steal the inventory. They will know that the inventory can be stolen. Oh, is that a valuable inventory? The same material that's labeled high-level waste by our current government, our current Congress. Now, plutonium is an interesting chemical element. It is created in a nuclear reactor. The Manhattan Project built 8 of these reactors at Hanford. The first one took 12 months from sagebrush to nuclear steam to build, and it had never been done in that size before. How could they do that? Why did they do it? To create this element called plutonium. Plutonium has been assessed as being the most hazardous material on Earth. Now, from the standpoint that you can make an atomic weapon out of it, yes, it is quite hazardous. because a piece of it that big, 2.5 kilograms, that's only 5 pounds, is the force that delivered 20,000 tons of TNT equivalent over Nagasaki. Indeed, it is hazardous. The one over Hiroshima that had fully enriched U-235 in it was 5 times as big. So plutonium is more dangerous than U-235, is it not? By a factor of 5. It takes 5 times as much U-235 as it does plutonium. Therefore, it is the most hazardous thing. Enter the great pretenders. They said that 5 grams of plutonium, properly distributed over the face of the earth, would kill everybody on earth. Now, if you can only get one 20 kiloton weapon to go on 2,500 grams, how's 5 grams going to kill everybody on earth? Early on, I had a fear that said, if there is this much fissile material, that can undergo a chain reaction, we called it in the beginning, then if you set a match to it, all the fissile material in the world is just going to keep right on going. Totally unfounded fear. It turns out that when you're in this business of recovering plutonium, like we recovered so much of it at Hanford, we found out that if you have it in a solution where it's less than 5% plutonium, it won't go critical any way that you kick it. And when you get it to 100% plutonium, you better be careful. Because if you put it in more than a 5-inch diameter cylinder, you're playing with fire. You can undergo what is known as an uncontrolled criticality, accidental criticality. The air turns blue. If the cylinder is sealed, it will explode from steam pressure. And that steam pressure builds up in a millisecond, which is about that long. No, you don't horse with it. And then you find out that those 8-foot thick shielding walls on those canyons were put there because they didn't know how much was a critical mass. They says, if we make a mistake, we don't want to die, so we will provide the shielding. And so the shielding thing started for no other reason than they didn't know what was a critical mass. Well, through the years, we got pretty good at telling what a critical mass was. And I have worked in a plant where I had half a critical mass in this hand, barehanded, dressed in street clothes, half in this hand, wearing a lab coat, and I'd put this half in a pocket on this side and this half in a pocket on this side and walk down the hall. If those two ever got together, there would be a blue flash. They never got together because I was in between them. And we do that every day. And each half had to meet definite dimension characteristics. And so we'd take them down and pass them one half at a time, and they'd measure it and say, yeah, that one will pass. And then we'd pass them the other half, and that one will pass too. But they were carefully put in separate bird cages so they couldn't get together accidentally. Well, those of us who worked with it enjoyed it. We knew what we were doing. We worked at it. When the President of the United States decided not to operate that fuel reprocessing plant, I started scrambling to find out what was going on. Many things had been done in the name of health and safety. Don't get burned. You got to have a safety record. You have to be safer than anybody else. We were already safer than anybody in the whole world. Well, you can't afford to get burned with this. You've got to enforce the limits. You've got to keep it. And I says, hey, that's not what the ball game is at all. I'll bet you the ball game is something else. And in 1982, when the Congress passed the Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982, a guy by the name of Mo Udall, I don't know whether you people in Arizona have ever heard of him or not, authored that bill. It's called the High-Level Waste Disposal Act of 1982. The material he called waste is the reusable uranium fuel that I had been working on for 32 years. Needless to say, Mo Udall and I do not agree on whether that material is waste or not. The name of the game then is, who owns the plutonium and how much is it worth? The government says bury it 3,000 feet deep in basalt, and we'll hold a contest among the states to see who gets to bury it. Oh? Why do you want to bury it? Did you ask the owners? Who is the owner of the plutonium? May I submit that it's most likely the nuclear power ratepayer. He is paid for the mining, the fabrication of the parent uranium, power generation, and is being charged in advance for its burial. If you're paying for it, to whom does it belong? How much is it worth? In inflated dollars, a ton of reusable uranium fuel contains useful metal isotopes worth upwards of $10 million a ton. Mo Udall says it's high-level waste. The value of reusable uranium fuel scheduled for permanent disposal probably exceeds the national debt. Naturally occurring plutonium quantities, and you know plutonium does occur naturally. Plutonium-244 is found at the residual activities of the several, 8 at least, Oklo phenomenon reactors across the world. First one found at Gabon, Africa. Naturally occurring plutonium quantities have been enhanced by transmutation of uranium. That's the reason we built reactors in the first place. Our ability to detect and measure emissions from these elements is useful in inventory control. When fissile elements, fissile isotopes, are present at less than 5 weight percent, plutonium-239 equivalent, and the heavy metal oxide matrix is stored dry in air, it has no critical mass. Remember we talked about shielding was because they didn't know what a critical mass was? If it is light water reactor fuel at less than 5% equivalent fissile content, you can handle it, you can do anything you want with it, you can stack it up, you can have a room full, you can have a handful. As long as you keep it dry, it will not sustain a chain reaction. What then is all this falderall about a little bit, 5 grams will kill everybody in the world? They don't know what they're talking about. And when they say that, they're thumbing their nose at measurement experts like Galen Windsor. I am insulted when they say those things and get away with it because it has no bearing on the truth. It cannot be mishandled. It will not expose any person to an unshielded nuclear reaction. In other words, no controls are necessary except to prevent the pilferage of the inventory. Have you got that one? Let it register. Do you need governmental rules and regulations and instructions? No way. Then why do we have all of those rules? Inventory control practices capitalized on the fear of undereducated masses who work in the industry. I didn't say anything about ordinary people now. I'm talking about the people who have worked in the industry and those who cast stones from without. The Ralph Naders, the Jane Fondas. Now, it doesn't take you much thinking to find out that maybe the industry is the source of the problem. The industry is the one that made up the committees, that made the rules, that the Congress enforced. You ever thought of it that way? The strangest kind of feather bedding that's ever been dreamed up, it makes the railroad engineers look like pikers. The only amounts of fissile process materials that are of health concern to the handlers are those that can accidentally cause an unshielded nuclear chain reaction, or that will cause erythema from the shortest wavelength, highest frequency, and therefore the most easily shielded ultraviolet light emissions of the electromagnetic spectrum. Big words. Let's see what they mean. The emissions from uranium, plutonium, cesium, all of those things are only important if you assemble an amount that if you get this amount and this amount together, it can go critical. You can get a blue flash and therefore get burned. And that's happened 34 times in the business, and 8 men have died as a result of that. Accidental criticality. Documented in Los Alamos document 3611, if you want to check the source. Or if you've got enough of it together that it's giving off ultraviolet light of this particular wavelength and frequency without any intervening shielding, enough to burn you, sunburn you, erythema, reddening of the skin. If it's less than that, if the effect is less than that, then what is the problem? Excessive government regulation. That's what's the problem. Tritium. Heavy water. Deuterium is hydrogen 2. Tritium is hydrogen 3. If you let an inventory get away from you, what's going to happen to it out in the biosphere? Nothing other than it will become diluted and join the naturally occurring inventory of tritium, because tritium is created in the upper atmosphere by sunlight. We have a natural inventory of tritium. Then the only thing that happens when you release tritium, which is the trigger mechanism for bombs, it's the source of the push that makes it go, is that you lost a valuable inventory. Then what of these people that are pretending that a little bit of tritium is going to do you in? It is not so. What are those 2 points? Only if it is an economically recoverable concentration, or if it has a natural reconcentration mechanism. You know, there isn't any one of the radioisotopes out there that has a meaningful level of reconcentration in any of the species, not even the oysters in the bays in Maryland, below Calvert Cliffs. Why then are we still playing this game that any amount of this material is of hazard? Reusable uranium fuel, which has been isotopically enhanced in power-producing reactors, is a valuable national resource, not a high-level waste. The utility operators recognize the future worth of this commodity. Mo Udall, in that Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982, imposed a tribute of $1 per kilowatt hour, $1 per megawatt hour on all electricity produced in a nuclear plant, so that they can research and develop methods to throw it away. Why do the utilities willingly pay this amount to the Secretary of Energy to limit their liability exposure? Who pays that amount anyway? The consumer of nuclear-generated power. You have no choice, and therefore I call it a tribute. At the same time, they have provided their own storage basins at these reactors at ratepayers' expense to retain ownership control of the plutonium resource. So you consumer, you ratepayer, you taxpayer, are paying for the storage of this fuel, and WNP2 at Hanford has storage that will take them through the turn of the century, and yet every day they are paying a tribute to the Secretary of Energy, with the concurrence of the United States Congress, and signed by the President of the United States in 1982, 83. Who was that? Ronald Reagan. They have provided those storage basins at ratepayer expense to retain ownership control of the plutonium resource. I started playing a game one day, 7 years ago. I says, okay, Portland General Electric, you've got the Trojan reactor, you've got a storage basin problem, I'm going to make you an offer. I made them an offer that says, I will take all of your spent fuel, FOB your basin, if you will give it to me. In other words, I will take it off your hands at no expense to you. I will ship it, I will store it, I will do everything that needs to be done to that fuel. And you know what they told me? Can I quote them? Go to hell, Galen Windsor. We value it more valuable than platinum or gold. We're going to play the plutonium futures ourselves. Now, where did I learn that the name of the game is who owns the plutonium and how much is it worth? The first plutonium I saw was in a glass tube on the newsreel when I got back from the Pacific in 1946. And that they had in a glass test tube, they said, was worth $500,000. Certainly they had less than 5 grams of plutonium in that tube. That's pretty expensive stuff. And so for the show, they put a pot underneath it in case they dropped it. They said, we don't want to have to pick it up out of the rug. When it was decided for us not to operate this plant, plutonium was guaranteed on buyback by the federal government at $43 a gram. That's quite a price drop, don't you think? When that price guarantee went away in October of 1971, the price of plutonium became $10 a gram. It steadily went down to where its present worth on the market is a minus $2 a gram per year. That's what it costs you to hold on to a plutonium inventory on a material that has been declared worthless by the utility owners and rubber stamped by the Congress of the United States, and they're spending billions of dollars digging holes in ordinary rock so that they can throw it away, dispose of it. Okay, what are you going to do with it? Reusable uranium fuel may be properly stored in air-cooled, dry storage in a cost-effective manner. Nuchem in Germany offers this immediate and long-term option as a necessary and safe step prior to reprocessing. They're doing it in Europe. At least 4 regionally located facilities are available in the United States where this concept can be used right now. Barnwell Nuclear Fuel Plant in South Carolina, Midwest Fuel Recovery Plant in Morris, Illinois, this one, Nuclear Fuel Services in upstate New York, and Redox Processing Plant at Hanford, Washington. These fully shielded, already radioactively contaminated storage areas have secure, limited access. All have been operated under processing conditions of 10 CFR 50, and the MFRP has a 10 CFR 70 storage license, the only licensed storage facility away from a reactor in the United States. It singly, all by itself, is capable of storing all of the reusable uranium fuel that needs to be moved away from power reactors for the remainder of this century. We had that storage designed in 1975. Had the approval of the design. Why then are you spending money over here in New Mexico on the waste isolation project? Why are you spending money at Hanford at the basalt waste isolation project? Why are you spending money at Beatty, Nevada for storage when I can already store it in this building that's already built? I just named you 3 others that can do the job all by themselves too, and I know where there's 14 more buildings that can do it. What are we going to do? Redox and other excess facilities at Hanford are capable of dry storing all commercial REF until plutonium recycle, at least through 5% enrichment, is reestablished, or until the 22nd century, whichever comes first. RUF can be cost-effectively stored in existing facilities. Where does Mo Udall came off then, saying that you cannot use this plant for its intended purpose unless it is owned by the United States government. He has said that. The waste isolation projects are politically mandated wasting of national energy and construction resources. Plutonium proliferation by diversion of stored reusable uranium fuel is of minor importance compared to global availability of fully enriched uranium by laser isotopic separation. Let me explain that last thing that I said. Jimmy Carter said you can't ship plutonium to India, but in the same paragraph said you may ship them fully enriched uranium. Oh, Jimmy Carter, that peanut brain, what did he just say? He says that when the Israelis took out the reactor in Iraq, they had fully enriched uranium from France. And they says those rascals, those Iraqis, are going to take that fully enriched uranium, put it in that reactor, irradiate it to plutonium, and therefore have to recover the plutonium in a plant like this, and we stopped them when the fully enriched uranium makes a better weapon than the plutonium in the first place. Now, when the President of the United States says things like that, and when the press gives it credibility, I get insulted. And right after I get insulted, I get angry. And I've been angry for quite a while now. And finally, one day, I said, my own personal security is not important. I think I'll go tell this tale. All I want is to tell my story. The commodity that I communicate is called truth. And so then I ask you a question, a very brief, pointed question. Who owns the plutonium, and how much is it worth? And then I'm going to attach on to that a question I want you to think about till we talk again. If you haven't been burned by this particular source of radiation, what is your problem? You obviously have one. Otherwise, you would join with me in telling the truth about this particular commodity. And so yes, I'm recruiting helpers. What happened to the guys who taught me the business? Thousands of them. The hands-on business. Where are they? They're still there. Why don't they talk? Who are the they that say this is the way the business is going to be run, whether it makes sense or not?
Okay. In that quote he was talking about, he said in 1944, directly to Russia on U.S. Air Force planes out through Great Falls, Montana, Fairbanks, Alaska. So, yeah, he's talking about the Russians did not develop their own nuclear atomic weapon until 1949, and even when we supplied them the material and the knowledge 4 years after. So, yeah, 4 years after the U.S., the Russians came up with theirs because they got the information from the U.S. and it came from FDR, everybody's favorite president, right? Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The Delano stands for his family name. They made all of their money by murdering people in China, the opium trade deal. So that's where Franklin Delano Roosevelt got all of his money by murder over in China. So yeah, so he handed the plans off to Russia. So, and it also makes it interesting because in these mines, with Native Indians, it's interesting that they made the whole lawsuits about uranium, right? Because more and more it's looking like, well, it's more about sulfur, right? I think it's sulfur with a touch of uranium. So anyway, so 1945, U.S. builds, tests, and uses the bomb. 1946 to 1958, U.S. tests in the Marshall Islands. 1949, Soviet Union detonates their first bomb. Convenient, right? 4 years later. 1949 to 1989, the Soviet testing at Sima blah blah or the Polygon. Yeah. So, anyways, in 1950s onward, the nuclear arm race. So that's everything got started. They've got nukes. They're gonna get us. Watch out, those Russians. Two sides of the exact same coin, right? So where do the Russians get their uranium from? Well, they mainly get it from Kakistan. I'm not going to go deeply into all of this, just kind of brush around the surface, but Kakistan is the center of gravity for Russia-linked uranium supplies. So, the U.S. imports most of its uranium needs from Canada, Australia, Kakistan, Uzbekistan, and Russia. Even with sanctions, they still import Russia. Here's how the plot's setting out. The U.S., all of them themselves talk about the United States being an experiment, right? Part of the experiment is the U.S. has more power stations than anybody else in the world by far, right? Iran has like one, the U.S. has a whole bunch of them. The whole plan of this experiment, this is just my guess here, right, on the game board, is take down the United States first. That's why they needed more uranium places than other countries. Don't worry, they're coming for everybody else also. And at the same time, they were obviously going after the people within Russia with this stuff going on over at Chernobyl, creating dirty electricity. The only difference is this: if you're in a home and you have electricity, you're probably getting dirty electricity. It's probably not going to kill you next week, but long term is going to etch away. Long term, likely where all this anxiety and all this illness is coming from. So, yes, so that's where they're getting it from. So, anyways, it's kind of like a global pipeline, but they sure seem to need to have it, right? So, why they claim the U.S. has the most nuclear plants because, well, they just had to beat off those Russians, right? I have all of these listed down below because if you're going to plot to kill a bunch of people, you got to come up with a good storyline, right? They claim this: the U.S. has the most nuclear plants because it built early, built fast, and built across a massive economy. So yeah, I think it was all part of the plot. So let's talk a little bit about Chernobyl. Here's how most of us really think about probably Chernobyl. It happened in 1986. In the back of my mind, I think of it like this. Probably on the news, I saw a bunch of buses pull a bunch of people away from Chernobyl, and that's about it, right? I think I assumed it was just like one location. Actually, not true. It was more than one location. So the explosion in this location occurred early April the 26th, which is actually today in 1986. The nearby city of Pripyat, Pripyat, but that place was a major city, and that was not evacuated until 36 hours later on April the 27th. Another key day. I turned 75 on April the 27th. So anyway, so yeah, the 27 means something in all these people's minds. But anyway, so the explosion happened early April the 26th, 1986. 36 hours later. Okay, so during this time, people went about normal life. Children were playing outside. And they really want to focus on the children drinking milk. Okay, so you'll hear a lot about children drinking milk. So, and they're always talking about the children drinking milk and having thyroid problems. Okay, so then everything's going along as usual. Then the buses come in, but not instantly. About 1,000 buses were brought in. So evacuation was organized and relatively orderly. Residents were told, you'll be gone for a few days. That's why many left their belongings behind and pets were left behind because they were told, hey, no problem, just a couple of days, okay? So the 30-kilometer is called the 30-kilometer exclusion zone. It was not fully cleared all at once, okay? The rural area was evacuated over days to weeks. Some were never exactly evacuated. So a little bit of chaos, right? So we saw buses coming rolling in. We saw the narrative saying, oh, there was an explosion. And then everybody leaves, and then they leave the town. And the dogs and the cats and everything is left behind, right? People did evacuate by bus, but not immediately, and that is critical to be remembering here, okay? They didn't know basically what was going on. And who had the most severe cases? Well, firefighters. Firefighters and workers developed the acute radiation syndrome, and they ended up with severe burns, and some died within weeks. Now, that can also happen just from sulfur. Sulfur with a touch of radiation can knock you out and kill you. So, then thyroid cancer. So, thyroid cancer is also removable and surgical. So, thyroid cancers it's not minor, but it's not like what you think it is because it's actually something they can technically take care of, okay? But the other effects like leukemia and possible increase in cancers. But here's the thing, none of that other stuff was found. What you'll find is all this talk about thyroid cancer. And they say thyroid cancer had a clear case of iodine 131. Clearly, they say there was a strong spike. And they claim they had good data tracking. Okay, that's the claim. But remember, if you're taking those thyroid pills just randomly, I mean, how do you know these children didn't get this thyroid problem from actually taking too many thyroid pills or the wrong dose or something like that, right? So taking those pills alone can start to interrupt here. So during the 1986 Chernobyl disaster, they claim what was released was radioactive isotopes, gamma radiation, and beta radiation exposure. They claim it's not sulfur based. That's the claim, okay? But there were three different stages. It didn't all just happen all at once. 1977 to 1986, they had units 1 to 4 were running in full power. Then on April 26 of 1986, Chernobyl disaster destroys unit number 4. So they had unit 1 to 4, but the only unit that was destroyed was unit number 4. But they kept units 1 to 3 operating after the accident. So if the accident was so bad, why would you keep those other ones still going, right? Yet they claim the area was dangerous. So they said that, well, units 1 and 3 were kept running because they were still functional, the risk was partially contained, and the need for electricity outweighed the danger. So, so they say that it was a policy decision. So the Soviet grid needed the electricity. And shutting down completely had economic, industrial, and political consequences. So now, oh, to heck with all that radiation, right? We're going to keep those plants open. So, and they claim that, well, we just manage the worker exposure. And just like they claim that, well, that they had them rotate in shifts with limited exposure in theory, and they used some protection. But early on, the protection really wasn't adequate, so no idea how that really worked, right? So they prioritized and they said, well, we still got to have electricity, so let's keep these units 1 through 3 open. And so then they kept the workers there and they kept those units open, which I don't know, it seems a little odd if there's so much danger in the area, right? So, anyway, so then they bring in the cleanup workers, also known as liquidators. And they're the ones that they claim are the most studied. And there were roughly about 600,000 of those people. And they supposedly got tracked through registries in Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. And they were all assigned doses of medication, but often they were estimated. They were given periodical medical exams. They were studied for leukemia, other cancers, and other long term health effects. And this is where the most of the worker health data comes from, okay? And then they also tracked the plant operators in the units 1 through 3. They were tracked, but in smaller groups, okay? And they used less standardized data than they used for these liquidators who were brought in to clean out Unit 4, okay? So we are right off the bat, we got a lot of inconsistencies going, right? So they continued working at the Chernobyl nuclear plants after 1986. They claimed they were monitored for radiation exposure. They had medical follow-ups, though always not consistent over decades, okay? And the limitations. So what were the limitations? Well, the records were many times found to be incomplete and inaccurate. The long-term tracking of these people varied by country, was affected by post-Soviet system changes. And right about that time, this was 1986, what was it, 1991, that they became USSR. So conveniently, there was a lot of change in the air, right? But they did evacuate the families of these workers. So while the workers are working in mines or buildings 1 through 3, their families didn't return, okay? Because they only evacuated the nearby city of Pripyat. And they concluded that they had a 30-kilometer exclusion zone, okay? And the other families were relocated to other towns and regions, but they did not live in the long-term zone, okay? So they left the area. And then they brought in the workers and they stayed or returned on rotating shifts. And they lived outside the highest contamination areas and in controlled housing zones. So I guess supposedly, maybe if you run from one place to the next, maybe it doesn't hit you. I'm not sure what the logic is here. But anyway, so they continued working within the zone, right? And then there's been people that have returned to these zones. Some older residents, or they're calling them self-settlers, have returned and are now living in these zones that are supposedly so dangerous, okay? And all these pets are living there too now. So they claim that, well, the workers were tracked imperfectly, but significantly. Their families were not left in the zone, they were evacuated, while the workers were rotated in and out of a contaminated work environment. So that's what happened, okay? And then I went looking for, well, what is the latest news? Because that was, years ago, right? Okay. In order for this to be dangerous, you have to have DNA breaks in our DNA, right? That's why you need to sleep at night and not be eating a bunch of junk food, because during the night, our bodies have this magnificent ability to repair the damaged DNA. And what they're doing with this plutonium and stuff is to destroy our DNA. That's the whole battle between good and evil. They see us as somebody who needs to be destroyed, and they want to destroy our DNA. So I looked for more current things. So on the DNA issue, a study published in 2025 found a significant increase in clustered de novo mutations, meaning new DNMs, in the children of Chernobyl cleanup workers. These mutations result from breaks in the parental DNA caused by radiation exposure. However, the risk to health is considered relatively small, as most of the clusters that likely fall in non-coding DNA, which does not directly encode proteins. So cancer, as of 2005, about 6,000 thyroid cancers and 15 thyroid cancer deaths were attributed to Chernobyl. The United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation concluded that apart from some 5,000 thyroid cancers, there is no evidence of a major public health impact attributable to radiation exposure 20 years after the accident. And listen to this. No government studies were conducted following the Chernobyl disaster to assess its effects on workers, the liquidators, and nearby populations. Chernobyl workers and exposed populations were tracked through national registries and international studies. About 6,000 thyroid cancer cases in exposed children were clearly linked to the accident. Other health effects like leukemia in workers and possible long-term cancers have been studied, but are harder to isolate. Genetic studies in children of exposed parents have not shown a clear, large inherited health effects, although subtle DNA changes are still being researched. Sounds like kind of like a nothing burger to me. And let's pay attention to this. Sulfur dioxide exposure can potentially affect the thyroid gland, but there is no direct evidence that sulfur exposure in children causes thyroid issues. Well, yeah, there's no evidence because they narrow the cases down, like in the case of the native Indians, they narrowed it down to just the plutonium, right? They eliminated the sulfur. So they say sulfur dioxide exposure can potentially affect the thyroid gland, but there is no direct evidence. Well, yeah, if you don't test it, you don't know, right? Some factors that may influence thyroid health in children include iodine deficiency. Iodine is necessary for the production of thyroid hormones, and a lack of it can lead to thyroid problems. See, we don't have any kind of base of what these children's health was like to begin with, right? Autoimmune diseases, conditions like Hashimoto thyroiditis can cause thyroid issues in children. Environmental pollutants. Exposure to certain pollutants may increase the risk of thyroid disease. Obesity. Excess weight can lead to thyroid dysfunction. Pregnancy and lactation. These conditions can exacerbate minor thyroid deficiencies. So, children from Chernobyl may face thyroid issues due to radiation exposure. After the Chernobyl accident, children from Belarus living in highly exposed regions received mean thyroid doses by radioactive fallout higher than the survivors of the atomic bomb explosions. This led to an increased risk of thyroid cancer, especially among those who were young children at the time. The risk was highest in the age group 0 to 4 years. However, a study of children born to Chernobyl survivors did not find an increased number of genetic mutations, which suggests that children largely escape damage to their DNA from their patient's exposure. And that right there tells us a lot. That means the parents were not overly exposed to higher amounts of uranium. And we can see that in those children in Iraq and those children over in the Polygon. under on my website, on my tab called Smart Meters and Radiation, just scroll through that. I have all the history there. I have pictures of those kids from the polygon. The children look different. I couldn't find any pictures of children that look like that from the U.S. Testing, just in those areas. So some long-term effects of Chernobyl radiation: increased incidence of thyroid cancer. Children were most at risk, and cases did not seem to increase in adults. People exposed to radiation from Chernobyl have high anxiety levels and are more likely to report unexplained physical symptoms and poor health. No evidence of decreased fertility, and this is another absolutely huge marker in all this. Doses to the general population were low, so it is unlikely that there would be an increase in stillbirths, adverse pregnancy outcomes, delivery complications, or negative impacts on children's overall health. The health effects of Chernobyl nuclear accidents are still being studied. So yeah, they had another in Unit 2. They had a shutdown in 1991 of fire damage. Unit 1 was shut down in 1996, and Unit 3 was shut down in the year 2000. So the active production for those years was 1977 to 2000 and the late 70s to mid 80s. So some symptoms reported after Chernobyl do overlap with sulfur or industrial gas exposure, especially early on. The overlapping symptoms: the skin irritation, the burns, the eye irritation, tearing, respiratory irritation, fatigue, headaches, and nausea. These overlaps can make it look like a chemical exposure, like sulfur compounds. But with acute radiation, like they're claiming at Chernobyl, it damages the DNA and the rapidly dividing cells. And you get that from the acute radiation syndrome, the bone marrow suppression, the immune collapse, and the increased cancer risk, and especially the thyroid. So, yeah, I'm not trying to minimize that these people weren't hurt, but what I'm trying to say is I'm not so sure it's exactly like the story being told, because I found it even on the Russian search engines that there are no long-term known effects. There has been enough time that something would have shown up, right? And then they also have all those animals. They say, look, the animals are okay. Well, I think the animals, in my case, for example, it killed my one dog. My other dog was older, so it's hard telling, but for sure they killed my boy Marcos. My cats are very sick, but they're showing more signs of sulfur. I mean, they're I've still been able to keep them eating stuff. They're sick, but they're I don't know. It feels like you would think that being cats and stuff that they would be a lot sicker than they are. So I think the whole animal thing could be a little bit tricky there, right? Because they say that, well, they say that there's groups over there tracking the wildlife population and everything's okay. And yeah, I don't know. What I see is a lot of groups and quite a bit of confusion through all this stuff. I didn't see anybody firmly saying, "Yep, this is exactly it." So they claim that wildlife returning does not indicate a chemical style event. It reflects ecosystem rebound in the absence of humans. Yeah, but remember this, like out at Rocky Flats and those places, when they had to tear that place down, what they put up? Well, they put up a wildlife reserve. So I don't know. They seem to like to put up wildlife reserves to prove to us, everything's okay. Look, the animals are still alive. So I don't think that I would believe the whole thing because the animals are alive, that nothing is going to change. So, yeah, that part doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me. So, and the only spike they have is in the children with this thyroid spike. Well, like I said, there's sketchy information about who took the iodine, who didn't take the iodine. if these kids took too much iodine, what would be the effect of that? Well, I don't really know. But they claim there's a spike, so okay, I'll agree there's a spike. Um, and they're claiming there might be some long-term damage in the cataracts and stuff. But also remember, they say there's a known radiation effect that the eye lens is highly sensitive to radiation exposure. Well, I talked about this in the past. Sulfur makes your eyes screwy as heck. One day I think I'm going blind, and the next day, within 5 minutes, I think, oh, what was wrong with my eyes? They seem okay now. So, yeah, it comes and goes. So, yeah, anyhow, so I think the animals living over in Chernobyl, well, it can be another indicator that, well, the air is not that dangerous, right? And besides the children and the thyroid, which really hear me out, I'm not saying that it's a nothing burger that kids are getting thyroid cancer, but kids could be getting that thyroid problem, especially the 0 to 4-year-old kids, which seems to be the group they're talking about. Imagine a little tiny newborn infant breathing in those sulfur fumes and stuff. I think that's going to be a setup for a whole bunch of stuff. So, anyway, and not everybody was evacuated at the same time. I mean, the whole thing becomes so mushy, right? Um, so yeah, um, like I said, my impression of what had happened was completely different than after having actually looked into it. It appears to me that, well, one claim is that the reactor blew because instead of having two domes, they only had one dome. Well, okay, that's one reason, right? But here's the bottom line is the Russians are also in on the thing and they are also into this eugenics deal. So they themselves want power plants to also get rid of their own people, right? So it really is just the name of the game. And then they bring in all these researchers and stuff from these universities and stuff. I mean, I'm not really sure who can really be trusted in this whole thing, right? Because they all seem to be kind of part of the whole coin, right? You got the universities bringing the stuff in, then they come in, take a look at it. And I've talked enough about sulfur that I'm not going to go on a tirade over, but um, they claim that the thyroid cancer seen in Chernobyl exposed children are tied to radioactive iodine. Well, they say the body treats iodine as a magnet for the thyroid. That's what made the damage so targeted. So I don't know. I don't see a rise in thyroid with children to be 100% done by the urania, right? Because they keep talking about, they say the highest risk exposure came from contaminated milk consumed in the days and weeks after the accident, especially in rural areas that stayed in place. So, yeah, they claim the radioactive stuff got in the cows, got to the milk, and boom, the kids. Yeah, I don't know. I see so many other factors that I wouldn't want to just arbitrarily hop on this whole deal with the thyroid children, right? So, um, they obviously have registries of exposed children. They're doing thyroid screening, but these governments are the ones collecting the data and managing the care. So, well, I would have to say that everybody has a vested interest in everybody probably not having such a good outcome, right? This is about eugenics, right? Because the children weren't studied by one authority. They were tracked by their own governments, with international groups stepping in to coordinate and interpret the data. So they say that we're talking about hundreds of thousands of children initially identified, but only tens of thousands in the most carefully followed long term studies. There is no single exact number because multiple registries and cohorts overlapped. So roughly 1 to 2 million children lived in the contaminated areas across Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia. Of those, several hundred thousand were in higher contamination zones, and they were at greater risk for thyroid exposure, iodine 131. So, how many of these children were actually studied closely? Well, typically 20,000 to 50,000 children in well-defined term cohorts. These groups had measured or estimated thyroid doses. They had repeated medical follow-up and detailed records. And these are the children behind the strongest scientific conclusions. So they started out with 1 to 2 million children living in this contaminated area. And they say 20 to 50,000 were impacted. Hundreds of thousands of children were screened at least once, especially in Belarus and the Ukraine in late 1980s to 1990s. But not all were followed continuously. Many were one-time or short-term participants. Now, wouldn't you think if it was such a big issue that somebody would have been over there studying those kids like minute by minute? Okay, kid, take a breath. Take a breath. Come on, let's study these kids. No, it was fragmented, right? So nothing was done. Um, Nothing was done. Hundreds of thousands of children were exposed, but only tens of thousands of children were followed up closely over time. So, who really knows, right? By 2005, there were 4,000 cases of thyroid cancer in those who were children or adolescents at exposure. By 2015 to 2020, there were 6,000 cases documented. Yeah, I don't know. Thyroid cancer in children is normally very rare. But they're looking at the population because they didn't do any base studies on these kids before this, right? So, um, they say that, well, based on this, we would expect that, and because of that, this is that. Yeah, well, I don't know. It's the ionizing radiation that damages the DNA, and that is a damage that leads to children being born disrupted and also leads to cancer. But doesn't sulfur also lead to cancer? So, yeah, they claim it mainly hit the thyroid because the radioactive iodine, I-31, entered the body through milk and food. The thyroid actively absorbs iodine. So, yeah, and children had smaller thyroids, obviously, for higher concentration levels. So, yeah, I ran around this circle with the kids for really a long time, and I really, what they found, each group found a little bit of something else. One group said, well, there's leukemia and some increased risk in high exposed groups, the liquidators and the cleanup workers. Other cancers, possible increases, but less clear and harder to prove. Genetic effect. No strong, consistent evidence in humans despite animal signals. The World Health Organization, who are you going to call? They collaborated with affected countries. They published long-term health impact studies. Who are you going to call? They confirmed the thyroid cancer link. They said leukemia risk in certain groups. Other cancers, uncertain, mixed evidence. Yeah. And they studied 600,000 cleanup workers or those liquidators. So they found leukemia, especially early years after exposure, and some evidence, but they didn't find what people are seeing. And they said the data was also complicated by smoking, alcohol, and incomplete dose records. So, um, yeah, they have national cancer registries in this place and that place, but nothing was consistently done. And I would have thought just the opposite, right? I would have thought that this whole thing at Chernobyl is such a big deal. They say that leukemia increases in highly exposed workers are supported by evidence. Other cancers and genetic effects have been studied extensively, but these signals are weaker, harder to isolate, and are still being debated today. So, thyroid cancer is the main one that they keep wanting to look at, right? Um, so I don't believe that's true at all. Radiation, what Chernobyl actually was, they claim it's caused by radioactive isotopes, iodine, cesium, damaged cells and DNA, and can produce radiation burns, which will look like chemical burns, internal injury after inhalation and ingestion. And then, of course, they have the sulfur, but they claim the sulfur does not cause the same DNA-driven disease patterns like cancer in the thyroid spikes do. So it's all being inhaled, right? Sulfur or the other uranium. And I think it could be, like I said, I don't know enough about these studies. I have everything you ever want to take a look at down below. I certainly looked at it all. I just don't get the idea that this is all about uranium. It just doesn't, it's not making sense to me. It's not making a sense to me at all. They say no transgenerational effects. Studies found no evidence that radiation exposure from the Chernobyl accident caused genetic changes that were passed on to children. Yeah, DNA double strand breaks. The higher the radiation dose, the more likely the thyroid cells bore a type of mutations called a DNA double strand break. In people exposed to higher radiation doses, thyroid cancers were more likely to result from gene fusions when both strands of DNA are broken and then the wrong pieces are joined back together. Additionally, plants in radio-contaminated areas of Chernobyl can face a significant risk from biotic stress factors. Low-dose chronic irritations can reduce the polyimmunity potential of plants and enhance race formation, leading to the emergence of new clones in the population of pathogen microorganisms. Whatever that means, I don't know, but um, they claim that the animals in the Chernobyl zone show some DNA damage and mutation signals, but they show that humans do not show clear inherited disease increases. So, yeah, studies have found clear evidence that Chernobyl radiation, excuse me, studies have not found clear evidence that Chernobyl radiation caused inherited genetic disease in humans, although small or subtle effects cannot be ruled out. So that's where all of this stands. Well, I think Chernobyl was the power station to wipe out the Russians over there, right? Get rid of their population over there because I am only getting the extreme version. Everybody else is getting somewhat of a low version of this sulfur thing going on right now, right? That's why I have been talking endlessly about getting some fans going. You need to get fans in your windows. What you do is this: the best way to put fans in a window is to use picture wire. And you only want to use like the 20-pound picture wire because these fans don't weigh a lot. But using the picture wire, you could actually hang that fan right in front of your window. Now, it depends on how close you have neighbors and if your fan's noise will bother people in your neighborhood. For example, what you're looking for when you go to look for fans is you're looking for the CFM, okay? The CFM controls the speed. For example, there are some 20-inch box window fans that run about $26. They are 1800 CFMs, okay? Or you can get more of an industrial fan, which is much stronger for about $34 for just a few dollars more, and those run 2,661 CFMs. So quite a big jolt for just a little bit of extra money. But if you've got neighbors close by, you may not want the really high, powerful fans blasting your neighbors and stuff. So what you might consider doing is putting a fan in the window that's not going to blast as loud as that. And those 20-inch box fans don't make that same huge noise as the industrial size fans do. If you put one of those fans in your window, it's not going to make that roaring noise. And what I have on the side of my bed, I have it's called a tower fan. Tower fans are a little bit more expensive, but they don't make all the noise. So if you're noise sensitive and you can't have noise around your neighborhood, then look at tower fans to put in front of your window to get that air moving inside of your house. So also, in terms of children and medicine, if you do not have any marijuana on hand, I don't know what you're going to do. If you had to take a child to an emergency room, it's not only going to cost you hundreds of dollars, but would you really trust those pills? Besides, the kid's going to be suffering that whole time, right? While you go and wait in line and blah, blah, blah. Spend hundreds of dollars for some pills. So if you've got a kid who's reacting to the sulfur in the air, some people would say, well, you're not talking about giving marijuana to children, are you, Diane? Yes, I am. You would give children pills from a doctor now, wouldn't you? So, what is the difference? Obviously, if you give marijuana to a child, you need to really take responsibility and fully monitor that child or that elderly person, and you need to stay with them because you don't end up just higher than crazy. We have CB receptors throughout our entire body, so it works like medicine. It stays within our system. So you don't need to rush in with a whole bunch because you use too much and you just waste it actually because you're not gonna there's a law of no return when you're dealing with weed. And literally it only takes a few drops. So what I'm saying is this, if you do not have any weed on hand and you've got children or elderly people, how are you going to explain to them, how are they going to, if they continue throwing up, you're going to lose them. That's going to eventually be what will kill them. So you need to have a way to treat them. And if you have this as part of your arsenal and your pets, you will be able to take care of it on your own. Probably what you would spend on one doctor's office would give you enough weed in your arsenal to have for like a year of care, right? So I've said enough about that. I have got to close off this file. So be safe out there. I think we got to use our heads about this thing. I think this gentleman was correct. Plutonium in its purest form is not that dangerous. That tells us a whole lot more about this sulfur angle now, doesn't it? So be safe out there and goodbye for now.